Hi, I'm Anna Sellars. I'm a Senior Rural Business Consultant with SAC Consulting. I'm here to talk to you today about the three big questions that farmers are asking about carbon. So it's really important for farmers to consider using a carbon footprinting tool to assess their emissions on farm. This is really useful for getting a baseline measurement of where you are and to be able to think going forward what areas you might be able to improve efficiency-wise, be able to reduce resource use and reduce your emissions ultimately. This creates a really useful baseline from which you can then benchmark your performance against other farmers, and it identifies areas of high emissions as well on farm, so you can target those areas, whether that's fuel use or feed use or performance of livestock. These measures as well can identify cost savings as much as they can reduce emissions, so they can really pay back spending that time in looking at those. And reducing emissions by, say, 10% over a number of years might seem like a big ask, but building up small incremental changes across the farm system will actually add up to quite significant changes overall. So if you're confused about where to start or don't really know how to begin doing that, it's really useful to think about getting some specialist advice from a farm advisor or looking at the Farming for a Better Climate website, where there's lots of resources and guidance notes on how to go about doing that. On farms, soil carbon can be increased or decreased depending on how the land is managed. All soils have resting carbon stocks, so existing carbon that is in the soil based on factors such as temperature, soil type, climate, the type of rocks that are naturally in the soil. So in the UK, that normally sits at between 80 and 120 tonnes of carbon per hectare at a 30 centimetre depth. Changes in the way that the land is managed, either through land use or land use change, or the way that it's managed through agricultural practices, can impact how whether that resting soil carbon stocks are increased or depleted. Agriculture is part of a natural carbon cycle where carbon is captured and stored within plants as biogenic carbon. This then feeds into the agricultural cycle through the grazing of livestock on grasses or the harvesting of plants to use for animal feed or food. And that then is regenerated back into the cycle through plants degrading or through livestock or human waste. Without interference in this system, it's in a carbon balance. So it's in an equilibrium, but the way that that system is managed agriculturally means that the soil carbon, the amount of soil carbon being recycled can be affected positively or negatively. The principle used by the IPCC is based on a 20-year period. So agricultural management practices, if they're continued over a 20-year period consistently, then at the end of 20 years, the soil carbon stocks can be said to be affected either positively or negatively. So for example, if grazing management practices have been improved over the 20 years, at the 20-year mark, the soil carbon stocks will be at an increased level. However, to continue the storage of carbon within the soil at the increased level, those management practices have to continue. And if you then want to increase to another increased level of carbon stocks, a new management practice has to be implemented on top of the ones that have originally been done. Carbon sequestration is not an infinite process, so you can't just keep sequestering carbon year after year. Similar to soil organic matter, there will be a natural threshold for carbon in soils and the amount that you're able to sequester. As part of the natural carbon cycle, carbon stored is removed by grazing animals, which is then recycled, returned back to the atmosphere in terms of enteric fermentation or manure. And the proportion of grass not eaten by the stock or removed by harvesting, together with roots, will then decompose and return soil carbon back into the soil. So the ability of grassland to sequester carbon really depends on various factors, including grassland management practices, forage utilisation, stocking density, reseeding practices, as well as land use factors such as the length of time it's been in grassland or the soil type. In many cases, management practices might deplete the soil carbon, or soil carbon might reach a state of carbon balance where soil carbon can no longer be increased without further beneficial management practices. So with good grassland management practices, it might be possible to increase the soil carbon sequestration through grassland, but it should be recognised that it's really just a fraction of total farm emissions. It's very unlikely that grassland sequestration will be able to offset total farm emissions. However, this is all the more reason to focus on reducing farm emissions across enterprises and across the system, as well as thinking about soil carbon sequestration through grassland. And really the next steps there the best steps are to start measuring where you're at, to understand where you're at in terms of farm emissions, but also grassland sequestration. And from there, to be able to increase incremental changes across the system to both sequester and reduce emissions.